Hi, I'm Peter Chan, National Weather Service Program Lead of the Alaska Weather Show, and I have a very important change notice to share with you. The last TV broadcast of the Alaska Weather Show in the traditional sense over the airwaves will be on Saturday, June 30th. Starting on July 1st and thereafter, the National Weather Service will provide a modified web-based version of the program on a new YouTube channel. So that means you'll be able to find us. We'll be moving from @AKwx TV to @NWS Alaska, and you can go ahead and subscribe to that channel now. There will be a public comment period from May 15th through July 30th, so please send your comments or concerns to nws.service-change-comments@noaa.gov. And if you have any other questions, you may reach carrie.haisley at noaa.gov and donald.moore@noaa.gov. Thank you for your patience and understanding.
Okay, first up tonight, the fire danger map for grass. North Slope here, some very high fire dangers up there as far as grass goes. And really, the interior here, all the blue area is low with the recent significant rainfalls they've had. But that's not the case here north of the Alaska Range into the mid-Tanana Valley there. And just to the northwest of the Alaska Range, still some very high fire dangers for grass. Copper River Basin, central Copper River Basin, same thing. And a little bit out here along and just southeast of the Yukon River there in the lower Yukon River Valley areas. And from there, going to hazardous weather graphic, there's a flood watch out for the streams draining the southeastern Brooks Range area. And also that extends down into the Koyukuk Valley. So flood watch is due to the recent rains and continued snow melt there. And that's out through tomorrow afternoon or into Sunday evening for possible flooding with the river levels up near Bankful. So possible flooding anywhere through this area for the next 24 hours or so. Satellite imagery showing a band of clouds here kind of spreading westward and a little bit to the east. More moisture here over the eastern interior areas in toward Fairbanks, some cloudy skies, but no precipitation. They still reached into the lower 70s or around the Fairbanks area today. So it's kind of mid and high level clouds there. And then the next system down here, you can see approaching the Alaska Peninsula, center right there. Clouds already spreading up to the Alaska Peninsula. Kodiak Island, a little bit of a break today. That break extending up into Cook Inlet as this upper level trough moisture kicks off to the northeast there. Kept some showers in over the Panhandle. Pressure's already starting to fall. Kodiak State Airport now in response to this next system advancing. And rolling that again, we'll see on the chart, that's going to already starting to spread some rain and increasing winds, mostly southern Kodiak Island. Otherwise, this trough kicking through earlier today and seeing some clearing now, kind of a break, some ridging ahead of this next system coming up. And we'll see for tonight that low center pulls back toward the Alaska Peninsula down to 980 millibars. So gale force winds and rain, probably 40, maybe 45 knot winds coming into Kodiak Island, especially ahead of that front later this evening. And then the front moves through, and still enough gradient there to keep gales going, and increasing wind, rain into the Barren Islands, western North Gulf Coast, Kenai Peninsula, southern Cook Inlet, chance of rain all the way up into the Matanuska Valley, southern Susitna Valley toward morning, with increasing winds, pretty gusty east winds, Turnagain Arm and the mountain passes of south central Alaska, windy, wet conditions up into the Bristol Bay area and the Kuskokwim Delta, southern Kuskokwim Valley to a lesser extent. Showers more or less continue to diminish over the interior areas, and it stays dry over the southeast coast and pretty unsettled for the Bering Sea. But wind's pretty light out in this area. We'll see tomorrow real light winds out here over the Aleutians and the western central Bering Sea. This low pulls northwestward. Front weakens, so look for periods of rain, gusty winds, diminishing winds, but still pretty breezy tomorrow for south central Alaska. Rain and a lot less wind for Kodiak Island, with the rainfall becoming lighter, more intermittent in the afternoon. A few showers of this trough, risk of a thunderstorm. Partly to mostly sunny skies north of the Alaska Range up to the eastern interior, North Slope areas back down toward the Kivalina area, Noatak Valley. Increasing chance of rain along the north coast of the Panhandle. And then that kind of moves through, so look for some improvement, some sunshine moving into the southeast coast on Monday. Otherwise, this low right along the Yukon Delta coast continues to weaken, keeps wet weather out in that area. In fact, most of interior Alaska looking pretty cloudy and showery and cool. Isolated thunderstorms over the eastern interior, as well as the Aleutians, a little more showery. Lows tonight in the 40s, southern Alaska and the Panhandle, followed by highs tomorrow, 60 to 65 in the Kuskokwim Valley and southern southeast coast. Otherwise, upper 50s to lower 60s, Copper River Basin, south central Alaska, 50 for Kodiak, 50 for Seward, 52 for Valdez. Lows again in the 40s, warmest over the Panhandle, followed by highs upper 50s to lower 60s for the southeast coast, and that's actually pretty good here for much of interior Alaska. A little cooler for the Kuskokwim Valley, lower to mid 50s, same thing for Bristol Bay. Up to the north, lows tonight in the 40s, except upper 20s to lower 30s again for the Arctic coast and North Slope. Highs tomorrow, lower 70s, eastern interior or upper 60s, near 70 in the central part of the state, and then cooling back, still near 60 for Nome tomorrow, though, and almost into the 40s for the Arctic coast, North Slope into the 50s, lows in the 40s, highs the next day, cooling off again, more clouds, moisture, so highs in the 60s, 50s and 40s back to the west, down along the southwest coast. Lows tonight near 40, upper 30s for the Pribilofs, and highs 40s to lower 50s for the day on Sunday afternoon, followed by lows near 40 for the Pribilofs, lower 40s for the Aleutians, and mid-30s for St. Lawrence Island, followed by highs, lower 50s here for the Alaska Peninsula, with 40s elsewhere, except lower 40s for St. Lawrence Island.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
All right, we've got some IFR here, northern Bering Sea, then extending down southeastward into the Alaska Peninsula. Some more IFR, central Aleutians, and another round of IFR here with southeast flow and that front coming up, spreading up into southern Kenai Peninsula, into western Prince William Sound there, extending down to about the Fognak Islands. Otherwise, pretty good VFR for Sunday morning, interior Alaska. A little bit of marginal VFR still lingering along the southeastern Brooks Range there, maybe the northern Koyukuk Valley, but mostly along the mountains and areas. Some IFR to start for the northern Panhandle. And for the afternoon, we'll see this area of IFR with the front pushes eastward there, increasing the marginal VFR along the central and north coast of the Panhandle, and marginal over Lincoln Glacier Bay VFR elsewhere there for the southeast coast. And marginal VFR, North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, into a good portion of the Copper River Basin, also along the western Cook Inlet, or actually Cook Inlet, and then along the eastern slopes of the western Alaska Range. And Kodiak Island marginal, IFR there, Dillingham, Togiak, Cape Neuanem, over to the Pribilofs, and then north, St. Matthew Island, through the Bering Strait, and up into the Chukchi Sea. North Slope Arctic Coast, VFR, a little bit of marginal VFR there, say Wainwright on down toward Point Lay to Cape Lisburne. Aleutians, marginal VFR. And for the morning on Monday, no change out here over the southern Bering Sea and Aleutians, although next batch of IFR pushing into the far western Aleutian, Shimei and Attu. Still some IFR here over the northern Bering Sea, a little more expansive as you head north in towards St. Lawrence Island, through the Bering Strait, and now IFR along the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, central coast as well. But Brooks Range, VFR, right on down to the Alaska Range, southern Alaska, mostly marginal VFR with a band of IFR here right along the North Gulf Coast, southern Kenai Peninsula, maybe into Resurrection Bay. And that pushing in across the northern Panhandle, marginal VFR, Kodiak Island, the Aleutians, southern Bering Sea. And then for the afternoon, just marginal VFR for the southeast coast, Gulf of Alaska, and the North Gulf Coast, up into the Wrangell Mountains coast range here. Maybe the Talkeetna is kind of marginal, but Cook Inlet for the most part, VFR down to the Barren Islands. Kodiak Island, marginal. IFR, again, northern Bering Sea here through the strait and up mostly off the Arctic coast. Good VFR for the North Slope, right on down the Tanana Valley, Koyukuk Valley, Kuskokwim Valley, at least the northern half around McGrath and Nikolai look pretty good, as well as the Seward Peninsula. Passes tomorrow, Brooks Range open, Anatuvik and Adigan. And for Lake Clark and Merrill, marginal VFR, especially on the eastern approaches, rainy, marginal, lowest conditions, eastern entrance, windy, VFR. And for Isabel, starting out VFR, trending toward marginal VFR as moisture comes northward. Mentasta, VFR becoming marginal. Tanita, marginal VFR. Portage, IFR. Chilcoot and White, marginal. And looking at the freezing levels, 4,000 feet, southeast Bering Sea, eastern Aleutians, right in across southern Alaska there. 6,000 to 8,000 feet tomorrow morning over Kodiak Island into the Panhandle, and around 6,000, give or take, over interior Alaska. Icing that low pressure area pulling into the southeast Bering Sea here. So quite an area of possible isolated moderate mixed or rime icing there. And then probably along in advance of the front, some considerable moderate rime icing coming up to the North Gulf Coast, and chances of icing increasing there over the northern Panhandle and along the central coastal areas throughout the day. And for the jet stream, southwest flow carrying that moisture right into the southeast coast, south to north flow pulling it up into southern Alaska there. Low pressure pulling back at this elevation in toward Bristol Bay. 9,000 feet, about the same pattern here. Pretty good winds, 50 knots there, sweeping across the Alaska Peninsula and into the southwest interior, and about 40 knots there over toward the Copper River Basin. And looking at 3,000 feet, low pressure, again, pulling northwestward, southwest of Cape Newinham. 55 knots southwest winds there, swinging up and becoming southeast 40 in the interior. 50-knot winds along the North Gulf Coast. Look for moderate turbulence, central northern coast of the Panhandle, all across southern Alaska, especially over the southwest interior to Kodiak Island, Aleutian Range to Unalaska Island, and then light to isolated moderate turbulence here around that area, maybe even the western Arctic, eastern Arctic.
You guys got everything tied down back there? Yeah. Yep. We're going through the lee of St. Elias, so there might be some turbulence.
Fasten seatbelt sign on.
Well, who am I to tell you what to do?
There are tens of thousands of glaciers in Alaska. Some stunning cliffhangers, others wide glaciers that come down to meet the ocean tides. Some, like this one we flew over in August, are easily visible from low Earth orbit and are mesmerizing from 1,000 feet above, and have trees growing on top of their soil-laden boundaries. Those glaciers, although they represent only a fraction of the world's ice, are contributing much more than their share to sea level rise. Chris Larson and his colleagues have repeatedly measured 220 of them in a small single-engine otter, measuring their height with lasers and their depth with radar, and watching them change from season to season and year to year. But Alaskan glaciers are also different. We're only just figuring out how they all behave. Data from flights like these, part of NASA's Operation Icebridge, can help fill the gaps. Chris and radar specialist Martine Trufer are both from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and both seasoned Alaskan pilots. But they rely on their good friend and legendary bush pilot Paul Kloss and his 35,000 hours in the cockpit to fly the incredibly demanding flight lines the mission requires.
And does it help you guys being pilots too?
I would like to think so, but watching Paul fly and seeing what he does, it's kind of like trying to learn quantum mechanics in kindergarten.
You know, I can fly my airplane around, but just seeing what Paul does in this extremely challenging environment in the mountains while trying to follow a specific flight line at a specific altitude above ground, negotiating winds, topography, maybe occasional low-level clouds that you have to get around, and just managing all that is just several levels above what I could do as a pilot.
Well, I think the first time I came here to this park, I was probably 4 years old with my father. I've been blessed to be able to fly in lots of places in the world, all over the place, actually, almost every continent. I guess I'm always looking for some place that might be better than this, but I haven't found it.
Paul's plane is about 60 years old and is the first single-engine Otter ever retrofitted with a 1,000 horsepower engine, which makes takeoffs feel effortless and gives Paul the ability to negotiate wild terrain, which he certainly did during the first 2 incredible science flights of this campaign. And with sunny skies and relatively calm air, we covered 3 vastly different pieces of ice. While Paul fueled up the plane, Chris gave us a preview of the day's science and scenery.
So it has one of the greatest coastal reliefs anywhere in the world. So it's between the ocean and the summit of Mount St. Elias, which is 18,008 feet high. It's less than 10 miles. There's a stupendous amount of mountain right off the ocean. It's hard to beat it anywhere in the world. It might be the prettiest for me. It's absolutely stunning. From here in McCarthy, we'll cross one of the bigger precipitation gradients in Alaska too. Here it's about 10 inches of precipitation a year, and we'll go over to an area where it's on the order of 200 inches per year. So it's from one of the driest parts of Alaska to one of the wettest parts of Alaska in about 45 minutes flight time.
Whoa, that's pretty good.
That's awesome. You want to do Tyndall next?
Sure, where you want.
If the winds are calm now, might as well grab it.
First, we came to the rugged landscape of Icy Bay, which not that long ago wasn't a bay at all. It was filled with ice. Tidewater glaciers in this region can make dramatic advances and retreats as they feed on high rates of snowfall and then retreat as they're melted by warm ocean waters. Like the Tyndall Glacier seen here, most of these glaciers have retreated dramatically over the last 100 years. But nearby Yahtzee Glacier, after years of retreat, is currently the most rapidly advancing glacier in Alaska. Overall, though, the Icebridge Alaska surveys, from the Denali region in the north to the Juneau ice field in the southeast, have documented pretty substantial thinning of glacial ice. Areas seen here in orange and red show between about 10 and 15 feet of thinning per year.
There's 1,200. There's a nice waterfall up there from the hanging ice. When we very first started profiling this, Paul, this gravel fan in the one in the valley next to it didn't exist.
I was going to say,
this was
look at all the good landing spots here.
Yeah,
There's no place to land here before.
no, it was deep water.
After covering several of Icy Bay's glaciers, given that it was time for lunch, just like that, we landed in this unforgettable spot. Flying eastward, leaving Icy Bay behind, we came to the mighty Malaspina, one of the Earth's great examples of a Piedmont glacier that spills out like pancake batter onto a broad plain as it approaches the sea. It surges at uneven intervals, creating dramatic patterns on its surface as it distorts the moraines of rock and soil borne along by the glacier. The Malaspina is less dynamic than the Yahtzee and is only melting at about the average rate for Alaska, but that could change quickly.
It has the potential for being one of the bigger geographic evolutions in Alaska. Certainly my son will be able to witness some big geography changes there. There's potential for it being connected with the ocean through some narrow lagoons, estuaries, which would take a little bit of coastal erosion, but it's not too hard to imagine that where the Malaspina Glacier is now could become a large bay.
The data that Martine's radar provides could reveal how vulnerable the Malaspina is to melting by the nearby ocean. Here we see the radar returns from the surface of the glacier. And here is something that Chris's lasers can't see, the rocky bed of the glacier, giving us both clues as to what's happening under the ice, as well as a measurement of its thickness. Finally, we came to the Yakutat ice field, 300 square miles of absolutely doomed ice perched high in the mountains. Researchers even debate how this ice field came to be at all, since in its current configuration, it's hard to imagine how it could capture enough snow to form glacial ice. And so, even if the Arctic weren't warming faster than the rest of the planet, this area would be likely to melt within a century or two. But with many other glaciers, it's easier to see the connection between a warming planet and ice loss. Thanks to data from IceBridge and other surveys, we now have a good estimate of the current rate of loss from Alaskan glaciers, 75 gigatons a year. While airborne observations over Alaskan glaciers have provided a rich record of change in the area, those efforts are now augmented by NASA's newest ice measuring tool, ICESat-2. With 6 laser beams of its own, and orbiting the Earth every 90 minutes, the satellite will carry on the record of Alaskan change. For their part, Chris and his team will continue to do their surveys for at least the next 2 years, helping to validate the ICESat-2 data and make further detailed observations over the stunning glaciers of Alaska.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And marine forecast turning down on the south coast here. South to southeast winds 15 to 25 knots. Central coast easterly 20 to 30 knots. And then for the north coast here, east 25 to 40 knots. Much lighter over the inner channels inside water areas. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage. Winds south at 10 knots with 2-foot seas. And for Clarence Strait, light northwest breeze at 10. And moving on to the outlook for Monday, northwest winds 25 knots here for the south coast, seas 8 to 9 feet. Central coast west at 20 knots, and the north coast even lighter, west at 15 knots, with seas running around 8 feet. And for Lynn Canal, south winds at 20 knots with 4-foot seas. And for Stevens Passage, northwest at 15, Clarence Strait, northwest at 15, seas in both those areas at about 3 feet. Prince William Sound tomorrow, gale warnings, east winds 35 knots, seas near 10 feet. And for the North Gulf Coast, full gales, east 40 knots, with seas 11 to 12 feet. Southeast 40 knot winds. For the Barren Islands, 13-foot seas. And Kamishak Bay, east winds 45 knots, and small craft advisories for Cook Inlet for northeast winds at 30 knots with 8 to 9-foot seas. And for Monday, south winds now for Cook Inlet down to 15 to 20 knots with 4 to 5-foot seas. Kamishak Bay, south winds at 25 knots. Barren Islands, south winds 25 knots, 8-foot seas. And for the North Gulf Coast, southerly winds at 20 knots, seas right around 10 feet or so. Prince William Sound, much lighter winds on Monday from the south at about 15 knots with 3-foot seas. Kodiak Island for tomorrow, winds coming down from gale force later tonight and early tomorrow morning to southeast at 30. Otherwise, the Alaska Peninsula, west-southwest winds 30 knots, seas running 6 to 12 feet. Bristol Bay east winds 35 knots with 6-foot seas. And for Monday, Bristol Bay southwest winds 20 knots. Kodiak Island, small craft advisories, southwest at 25. Alaska Peninsula, southwest at 20 knots with 5 to 7-foot seas. And for Unalaska Island tomorrow, west winds 25 knots, seas 6 to 8 feet. And from Nikolsky out to Adak, light variable winds at 10 knots. And for the western Aleutians, northwest at 15 with 3 to 5-foot seas. And then for Monday, really laying down here out over the Aleutians, variable winds at 10 knots, seas running only 3 to 4 feet from Atka all the way out to Shimianatu. And for the eastern Aleutians, south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. Southwest coast, southern Nunivak Island, northeast at 30. Yukon Delta coast, east at 20. St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound, north at 20. And St. Matthew Island, north 25. The Pribilofs, north at 20 with 5-foot seas. Then for Monday, Pribilof, St. Paul, St. George, St. Matthew Island, all three areas west at 20 knots, 4 to 5-foot seas. South at 20 here for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. Yukon Delta coast northwest at 15 and light northwest wind at 10 knots for St. Lawrence Island. But Norton Sound, southeast winds 20 knots. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, east winds 20 to 25 knots, central and west side east at 20. And the Chukchi Sea, light east winds at 10 knots. And then for Monday, Chukchi Sea, winds stay light there, south to southeast at only 10 knots with seas up to 2 feet in the ice-free areas. Northeast 20 for the western Arctic coast. Central coast down to 15 knots out of the east. Lighter winds now for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast from the east and northeast, 10 to 15 knots. For tonight, here's that next big storm coming up to the Alaska Peninsula after midnight tonight, and gale force winds, rain becoming heavy at times, Kodiak Island, spreading in across Bristol Bay, and also up into the northwestern North Gulf Coast. Cook Inlet, south central Alaska, wind and rain on the increase, and increasing chances of rain for the eastern North Gulf Coast. And for tomorrow, that low pulls in back to the northwest here to about this location, slowly weakening. Stays wet and windy, but wind and rain diminishing for Kodiak Island, but staying wet and windy here overall is southwest Alaska, North Gulf Coast, south central Alaska, and increasing chances of rain along the north coast of the Panhandle. Next day, cloudy and damp.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.